Hi, I'd like to tell you the story today of how people get really crazy about a new way of making a human baby. What I'm talking about is the story of the birth, July of 1978, of Louise Brown, and who was called the test tube baby and raised all kinds of ruckus. I'm Gregory Pence. I'm a bioethicist, been so for about 50 years, and this is Great Stories in Bioethics. There's a lot of misconceptions about in vitro fertilization. In vitro means under glass. It's also called test tube babies, very misleading term. The reason test tube baby is misleading, it implies that like chemicals are poured into a test tube and out comes a little tiny baby, an homunculus, or something like the movie Gremlins. It's not true. Basically what happens in IVF, or in vitro fertilization, is that doctors give women hormones to make them ovulate or superovulate, and they take eggs out. They get sperm from a man in a jar. They take primed egg and the sperm, and in a petri dish, a little glass vial, they introduce the sperm and the egg very carefully to create a human embryo. And then they put it back. In this case, it does not come down the fallopian tubes, but they put it directly on the uterine wall, where hopefully, if the hormone balance is right, it will implant and gestate, and 9 months later, it will become a human baby. The only thing that's really different for an infertile heterosexual couple about IVF is that the sperm and the egg are outside the womb for a little bit. That's it. As the future father of Louise Brown would say, just helping nature along a little bit to create, and this is the point I'm going to emphasize, a very wanted baby. The background of this is that the first human created by IVF, it was like a lot of things like cloning later thought it couldn't be done. It was done by a physiologist at Cambridge University named Robert Edwards, who had been studying this for some time. He needed infertile women to try to overcome their infertility. With the help of an obstetrician named Patrick Steptoe, he recruited over 100 women who had been told they could never have children, and would they like to try an experiment to help them have a baby with their own eggs and their husband's sperm. After 101 times they tried and failed. The balance has to be just right of hormones for that embryo to gestate, and about a third of the time there may be a genetic defect and the embryo is discarded. One of the couples was John and Leslie Brown. On the 102nd attempt, they got the happy news that it looked like their embryo had implanted and had gone significantly into the first trimester. At this point, Steptoe and Edwards did amniocentesis and tested fetus for chromosomal defects such as Down syndrome. They later said that had the fetus been abnormal in any way, they would have encouraged Leslie Brown, the mother, to abort, but it was normal. So on July 25th, 1978, Louise Brown was born, and newspapers and magazines all over the world had huge headlines that a child had been created somehow artificially, somehow outside the natural womb. The reaction was just incredible. Some leading bioethicists said that this has been an ethical experiment on the unborn. A theologian named Paul Ramsey worried about a supermarket of embryos. The Vatican said it was immoral because it was unnatural. It was just incredible. A writer, science editor, wrote an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times saying that the issues of assisted reproduction raise more ethical issues than nuclear war. Wow, what an exaggeration. For John and Leslie Brown, they were very happy because they had a wanted baby. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that these babies are more wanted than maybe any babies have ever been wanted. A lot more couples are infertile than you might think. If you're 28 years old and both the man and woman are trying to have a child, about 1 in 11 couples, after trying for 2 years, are infertile and need some form of assisted reproduction to help them have a baby with their own genes. In 1981, when Elizabeth Carr was born in America at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia, people were so inflamed about test tube babies, the protesters were outside with huge posters with little babies in test tubes and a big red X over the poster. They didn't want test tube babies born in America. You remember the Edelin case where after Roe versus Wade, some doctors did some awful experiments on live-born fetuses. Because of that, Congress had barred any kind of federal funding on any kind of experimentation involving not only fetuses, but embryos also. The reason why was that they didn't know where to draw the line. And in fact, embryonic development through fetalhood, through becoming birth, is a continuum. There's no logical place to draw the line. This meant that IVF clinics had to finance their research through patient fees. And it meant patient fees were a lot, especially at the start. No insurance plans covered IVF. A couple might have to pay $12,000 to $18,000 per attempt, per cycle of IVF. And some couples tried 3 times. So it was quite expensive to have this. Like I said, these babies were very, very wanted, which should be reassuring to people. I mean, some people said, oh God, you're going to be a test tube baby. How would you have that stigma over you? I was born in 1948. I once asked my mother, was I wanted? And she's a good mother. And of course she said, of course you were wanted. But all I really know is that, there was no birth control or abortion back then, is that my parents had sex. IVF babies know they were wanted. A few years later, there were 95,000 babies born IVF in America. And by today, it's estimated that 1 million Americans have been created by IVF. About 2% of birth are due to some form of assisted reproduction. Again, all very wanted babies. Critics have still complained that this is unnatural. The Vatican still prefers married couple creating babies through heterosexual sex. The new techniques did open up new opportunities because it turns out that the age of the eggs matters a lot. And if you substitute an egg of a younger woman with the husband's sperm, your results get better. So the results have been hyped a little bit. Even after several tries, only about 1/3 of couples take home a baby. That means that 2/3 do not, which is not great. If you use the egg of a younger woman, the odds dramatically improve. Many celebrities, without saying so, who use IVF use the egg of a younger woman. Celine Dion comes to mind. That also means that you could advertise for a younger woman. And there was once a sensational ad in Princeton University's press for a woman with a high SAT who could get $50,000 for donating her eggs. I don't think that ever actually happened. It is true that altruistic egg donation is a lot to ask. You have to inject hormones in the young woman, make her superovulate, and the eggs are surgically removed. About 10 years ago in New York City, a young woman did this. She got about $18,000. I hate to say men don't get as much for their sperm. They get about $250 at most. On the other hand, there are some sperm banks that offer characteristics of sperm donors, and they charge today as much as $1,000 a vial of sperm, and anybody can get the sperm, a lesbian couple or whatever, which opens up another possibility that a lesbian couple could create an embryo with donated sperm, one of their eggs gestated without a man being involved, which bothers some people. Embryos can be frozen, recreated later. Sometimes the embryos twin. There are cases where one twin was born, say, in year 1, and then the other was unfrozen and gestated and born like 25, 28 years later. Pretty interesting. But again, new ways of making a baby. The world's not going to collapse because of this. There's a lot of unwanted babies around, and I think we should be grateful for all the wanted babies. There have been some mix-ups. There have been some scandals. In the fertility clinics, sometimes there were mix-ups. And one of the ways we found out is when a couple of one race got a baby of a different race. Uh-oh, what happened there? More dramatically, some male fertility doctors have abused their power. There was a physician in Indianapolis named Donald Klein who, at 80 years old, admitted that he had used his own sperm rather than the husband's to create 39 children. How was he discovered? Well, DNA testing, Ancestry.com, people started realizing they had brothers and sisters they didn't know about, started asking questions. In Holland, there was a fertility doctor, a male named Jay Carblot, who, again with his own sperm, created at least 139 children. This is not good because you don't want to marry your sibling. You can have genetic defects that way. There's also been other scandals. There's always been the worry about eugenics. Certainly a company now claims to screen embryos for high IQ. I don't believe that's possible. Eugenics is the subject of a future episode. There's also been, in my own state of Alabama, recently in a fertility clinic in Mobile, a technician dropped a vial of embryos and they were destroyed. They were the only embryos the couple had, and they sued. Now, normally they'd be suing for civil damages, for money. But in this case, the Alabama Supreme Court made a sensational judgment, really kind of an outlier judgment, and said the couple could sue also in criminal court as if a child had been harmed. That the embryos, in other words, under Alabama law, which makes it a crime to harm a child, counted as a child. Well, there were a lot of IVF clinics in Alabama storing embryo. Alabama is the home of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and it was quite alarmed by this. And many infertile couples and women who were in the process of using IVF came forward and went to the legislature and were just really ticked off. Thankfully, the Alabama legislature quickly reversed this opinion and passed a new law that said an embryo outside the womb could not be counted under the law as a child who could be harmed. And the governor quickly signed the bill. Nevertheless, some fertility doctors left the state. Needless to say, the business at Alabama fertility clinics went way down. Another episode we will talk about battles over embryos. I want to repeat that all these techniques, basically, the sperm and the egg were only outside the womb for a very small time. All the babies were very wanted. The couples who had the babies were very grateful. The alarmism, the sensationalism that occurred in 1978 and afterwards, in retrospect, was just so misguided. A tempest in a teapot. All these Jeremiahs who claimed the sky would fall, we're going to have a reproductive apocalypse, were just so wrong and so misguided. It's very easy to criticize a new technology. It's harder to see it as maybe helpful. A lot of these things are just tools. A hammer can hurt somebody, hit them in the head, or it can be used in Habitat for Humanity to build a house for someone who needs one. We have to take a lot of things with a grain of salt. Anyway, the alarmism about all this taught me an important lesson, one that I kept in the back of my mind and was useful. In 1997, a lamb named Dolly was cloned, and again, the world went crazy, thinking that humans were about ready to be cloned. But that's for another episode. If you like this story, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, ring the bell, and that's it for today.